Hello, I'm making this video about how to learn vocabulary in foreign languages because people repeatedly ask me to do so. And I must say that I've hesitated to make one and been somewhat reluctant to do so because very often explicit in those requests, or at least replied, is tell us what specific programs for learning vocabulary like Vocabulary or Anki or flashcards or word lists and things like that. Tell us which of these you use and which you find most helpful and which you think are the best and which you can recommend to us. And the truth of the matter is that I've never used any of these methods, and therefore I cannot recommend them. And a reason why I haven't used them is because I don't think that they are particularly helpful. So if that's the kind of information, specific recommendation for one of these specific programs, you're not going to get that from this video. So just know that now. What I'm going to talk about instead is how it is that I have developed the ability to read in a wide variety of languages, which means that I've got a large vocabulary, without focusing specifically on vocabulary learning. Behind that request about talking about specific vocabulary learning programs, behind the idea that one would want to focus particularly on vocabulary, that is something else that I find it indicates an underlying perspective that I don't share. If you want to just focus on vocabulary learning, what you're implying is that you're good to go with the grammar. You know the structure, you know how the language works, but you just feel like you don't know enough words to say what you want. So if you knew more words, you could express yourself. And I can certainly understand how one would come to think that maybe you've covered the grammar. Precisely if you're still in college and you've taken 2 years of a language, 4 semesters, and now you've passed into a beginning reading literature class, and it's hard because there's so many words that you don't know, but very strongly implied is that you've covered the structure and now you're moving on to another level. In a lot of books for teaching yourself languages, the last lesson will be, congratulations, you've learned quite a lot now, and you're ready to go and go meet people and converse with them and keep growing in the language and use it in many fashions. So again, it's kind of implied that you've covered everything. And there are a lot of other popular methods out there that, like Pimsleur and the Foreign Service Institute, that specifically talk about in their pedagogy, if you read the preambles, that they talk about that they're going to focus on overlearning the structure, giving you, really drilling you in the structure of the language, and consciously limiting the number of vocabulary to about 500 key words that you'll get out of that. So I can see how somebody who's relatively new to language learning might use a program like this and figure that they've covered the structure, and again now need to build upon that limited word base to get more words. So all of that is thoroughly comprehensible, and if you add to that, just think of the most sort of old-fashioned scholarly type Oxford University grammars and primers of languages, where you'll introduce the phonology first, and then the syntax, and then the morphology. So you're learning a bit about words, and then you're given some texts and go read them. So dividing languages up into grammar and vocabulary is it's not mystifying why one would do that, but I've just never done that. And when I learn a language and I realize that I'm not in position to read the books that I want to read in it yet, never thought to myself, well, I need to learn more words, I better build my vocabulary. I've always thought I need to learn the language better. So taking a comprehensive, holistic approach to learning the language, I guess, is the first way that I would go about building vocabulary. And so the concrete advice that I have to give is very appropriate for a certain type of learner, and it's not appropriate for another type of learner. Again, if you specifically want to focus on vocabulary or Anki, I don't have anything that I can advise you in those regards. And likewise, there is definitely a school of thought out there, a pedagogical approach that says that when you're learning a foreign language, you don't want to get you don't want to have conscious grammar. You just want to get the an overview, the bare minimum that you need to start functioning, and then plunge in, and it will grow naturally. And all of us in our native languages, and we've sort of got unconscious mastery of grammar. And from this perspective, learning grammar is at best a waste of time, but it's possibly harmful and dangerous because it'll get you make you inhibited and get you translating in your head rather than thinking directly in the language. And I think that's probably quite true for some people, for a certain type of learner, but it's definitely not true for a lot of other people. It's not true for me personally. It's not true for the kind of person that I think I can give good advice to. I think that when learning a foreign language, learning grammar thoroughly and systematically is very helpful and necessary. And beyond helpful and necessary, it's fascinating. It's, figuring out and understanding how other languages work. That's part of the beauty and the fascination of learning foreign languages. So if you can share the perspective that learning grammar consciously and thoroughly and well is important, then the first best way to building a really wider vocabulary base than you might find that you have if you just go through one language course, either taking it in school or teaching yourself by one particular method, is what I will call the multiple textbook approach, the multiple textbook method of teaching yourself. Either supplement to a class or teaching yourself is not to think that you're going to learn the entire grammar from any one textbook. So again, this advice is good news for those who are grammar nerds and textbook collectors and have what I call polyitis, or who enjoy learning and studying. And it's not such good news necessarily if you find textbooks tedious. But I do think that if you want to get, first and foremost, that conscious, really good understanding of the grammar and structure of the language, rather than thinking you're going to get it from any one course, I think it's kind of like hearing and applying good advice to change habits in your life. There are times when you hear something and you never heard it before, and it's like a light goes off and you're able to apply it immediately. But I think most of us with good advice, we just need to hear it multiple times, and you need to hear it the right number of times, and then from the right person and the right time and place in order for you to act on it. And I think that grammar is that way. Natural languages all have their subtleties and complexities, and you might find a textbook here and there that really does, in a very thorough and systematic way, present all the aspects of the structure of the language. But that doesn't mean that you can internalize it and that you can really act on it and understand it in that fashion, be able to use it in the correct way. And so from that perspective too, the multiple textbook approach is very helpful, because you'll be seeing the structure of the language in many different presentations. But the crux of the matter here for vocabulary is that you will be able to go through the exercises in multiple textbooks with greater and greater ease the more that you use, because the grammar and the structure will be clearer and clearer to you. But by using different textbooks and different types of textbooks, you'll be getting tons and tons of sample sentences that are teaching you vocabulary. So I think it's really important to use a variety of different types of textbooks. If you've watched my videos before, you know that I'm very fond of a French company named Assimil that works with bilingual parallel text. So on the left-hand side of the page, you have the language you're learning, and the right-hand side of the page, you have the language it's teaching you. You have recordings that are only in the target language, and I've talked about a technique called shadowing in various stages where you listen to and speak along with the recording as you read the target language, you read the teaching language, and then at a certain point you pause and you can look and you can make connections between the words. And so learning vocabulary in dialogues has always been sort of a primary approach of mine, rather than trying to build vocabulary from some sort of lists and that kind of thing. Apart from that particular method, I've also talked about, sometimes there aren't as many, but there's a sort of a parallel method to that called the linguaphone method. And linguaphone has it, instead of parallel pages, they've got it in two different books, but it also has an additional stage that you can add in the Linguaphone lessons. Not only can you look at the two dialogues side by side, but they've got the vocabulary in the order that it's presented to you. So you can also listen to and shadow while reading the vocabulary list, and that makes it a lot more explicit. So if you are interested in building explicit vocabulary, if you can find older Linguaphone courses for the kinds of languages that you're learning, that can be very helpful. I've talked about the nature method of language learning, books that are out there for a number of European languages, where you start just reading quite simply and you build upon using pictures and other things. You're able to learn to read by that. But I'm also very fond of some older style, typical, grammar translation books, if you can find these, different generations. If you've learned a language, a current language from an in-print now teach yourself book, some of them are pretty good. But then if you can find a similar teach yourself book from, say, the 1950s or 60s generation, you'll find a lot denser vocabulary, a lot more things, and you'll have gone over the structure of the language, so it'll be reinforcing that. But again, you'll just be building vocabulary. So I think the first best way, using my approach to building a strong vocabulary in a foreign language, is just what I've described, using multiple textbooks, a handful of 5 or 6 different textbooks that will reinforce your structural knowledge, but also give you more and more vocabulary of different types. A point will come when you've gone through all the textbooks that are out there that are interesting to you or that you can stomach, and then the next ways of learning vocabulary, if you're not going to specifically look at word lists and try to memorize them, are what can you do and how have I gone about doing it? I'm far from the only person to say that reading is the royal road to vocabulary. It's a simple fact that the vocabulary that is used in writing is wider, broader than the vocabulary that's used in conversation. So reading is definitely going to take you farther than conversing, but that's important too, and I will talk about that in just a moment. Reading, I have made multiple videos about different types of reading: extensive reading, extensive reading, what I call realistic reading, where instead of in extensive reading, you try to find a text that you know about 98% of the words. So out of every 50 words, you can not know one word. And then if you just keep reading and it's a story, you will assimilate. You'll get that word from the context without needing to look it up. Intensive reading, you basically look up every word as you come to it, and you spend a lot of time working at it. What I call realistic reading is you read a text multiple times and get the gist first, and then go back and understand a few more details, and you look up some of the key words that you don't know, and so you proceed like that. So various ways of reading, various types of things that you can read. Again, you can always, lots of bilingual texts similar to the Asimil books are out there that you can get in bilingual text columns. Those are extremely helpful. You can get a translation and make that a bilingual text. There are graded readers that are out there. So I think that reading is something that is definitely the best way to build your vocabulary, and there's plenty of ways that you can go to make that easier than sort of plunging right into the original Nobel Prize winning novel that you want to read. That might be your ultimate goal in learning a foreign language, but you need to be patient to get to that. You need to be patient even working with readers. You need to read a large number of books in order to increase your vocabulary, and you need to understand and expect that reading your first couple of books is going to be relatively slow and laborious and difficult. But if you stick with reading, in particular if you use these different types of books, that is probably the best way to ultimately build your vocabulary. But how about conversation? Conversation is also a very good way to make the vocabulary active and use it. And I think that when it comes to having conversation, that there is something that you can and should do that I think maybe most people don't necessarily intuitively do, and that is to plan for at least a certain number of your conversations. If you've got a language exchange partner, if you're paying somebody to converse with you, or you're living in a country and you know that you have certain situations that you can sort of plan for the things that interest you. You can sort of look up specific topical vocabulary and then try to employ it in conversation with somebody. So you're very interested in what's being spoken about and see if you're using the vocabulary that you looked up in a dictionary correctly. But I would say the critical thing with conversing is that you kind of need to, again, at least some of the time, take notes of it. Really make note of what your conversation partner is saying. And if she says a word that you've never heard before and you find really interesting, both from your notes there and also from, again, when I talked about that realistic reading method where you look up the keywords that are stopping you, it's important when you want to learn vocabulary that you take the words that you find interesting and you hear in these sentences, whether you've been reading or conversing in them, and you make a point of actively using them. Don't sort of note them down and try to memorize them, but actually try to think them into sentences and say them in sentences. And so make your vocabulary alive that way. So some targeted preparation for some of your conversations and taking note of what is said and making sure that you employ the words that you hear is an important way to learn them. Beyond that, there are times when you might say, particularly if you're learning a language that's more different from your native language. So we're all speaking English here. So English is related to the Germanic languages and the Romance languages on the one hand, and they've got a fairly similar vocabulary base. So that's one set of problems. But what if you step a bit wider? What if you start learning, say, Slavic languages, and you'll find that there's very different vocabulary? Well, then it does help. Sometimes you can get, if you're learning Russian, say, a book like this, Roots of the Russian Language, that will explain to you the roots, the specific things that aren't intuitive, that are not the same as they are in English, and that can be quite helpful to help you remember what words mean and why they mean them. I've got the most experience with that personally in learning Korean, where when I lived there and was trying to immerse myself in it and work really hard in my first couple of years there, it was very hard to retain new vocabulary precisely because the words didn't sound like they meant anything to me. They were just a random assortment of sounds, and I didn't know why they meant what they meant. But you can get books like that too. For example, a handbook of Korean vocabulary, a resource for word recognition and comprehension that also talks about the word roots. And so then these polysyllabic words, rather than just sounding like a bunch of sounds that you don't know why they mean what they mean, you can see the etymology and you can say, oh, yes, that's why this means what it means. And specifically for Korean, you've got both native Korean words, and most Korean words, like most English vocabulary, ultimately comes from Latin. Most Korean words ultimately come from classical Chinese characters. And so learning what are called hanja, the characters, that really helps make the etymology clear. And some people are scared of learning hanja or resistant to it because it takes a long time, and it's absolutely not necessary that one do so. You can plunge yourself into the language in other ways, but if you want to learn it in a scholarly fashion and know what words mean, then it's quite helpful. It does take time, but it's an aesthetic and artistic thing to learn how to write out the hanja. But more importantly, back in terms of vocabulary, when you really start understanding what the roots were, I can remember having conversations when I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what the word was. But when you know enough of how these characters come together to form words, I was able to think out what it was probably be and guess correctly at what the word would be. So when you understand the roots of vocabulary, that is a very helpful way to build your vocabulary. And so I guess that's the advice that I have to give about learning any one specific language, that rather than trying to divide it up into grammar and vocabulary, you take a more holistic approach to it, that in order to solidify both your structural knowledge and build a wider base of vocabulary, if you go through multiple textbooks of different types, you will get that kind of exposure. And then once you've done that as much as you can profitably do, you can turn to readers of various types of bilingual texts and work your way. Understanding it's going to take you have to read dozens of books. It's going to take you years to really develop the ability that you're going to be able to take a book in an advanced book, a serious work of literature, and just sit there and read it comfortably. Don't expect that to be a fast process. Working with conversation, targeting specific topics, looking it up, taking note, and making sure that you use words that you either look up or you hear actively so that they stick with your mind. Giving yourself a base in the structure of the roots of a language, if it's a different set of languages from ones that you know. So if you are concerned with a specific language right now, that's the advice that I have to give you. I can go a bit further and talk about a broader approach if you're planning to learn more languages and learn lots of languages. So a good way to build your vocabulary primarily would be to learn the classical languages. Ultimately, vocabulary in Germanic and Romance languages comes from Latin. And vocabulary in many, in a broad belt of languages from Swahili through Turkish, through Urdu and into Malaysian, all comes from Arabic. And most of the languages of northern India get their vocabulary from Sanskrit, and Japanese and Korean get their language from classical Chinese. So there's a handful of core languages out there, the classical languages of civilizations, that if you learn these languages first, you will really have a strong basis in vocabulary for then learning other languages that derive their vocabulary from them. But that's obviously a long-term and difficult approach. But if you're planning a structured life of language learning, that's something to keep in mind. And along those same lines, there is another approach that you can take to learning languages. And again, a good way for getting the vocabulary to stick, making the vocabulary, being able to retain it and use it, is to give it a web, a nexus, a context, and see how words are related to each other. And therefore, a good thing I think to do is to use something like this wonderful book, Comparative Grammar of Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French, by, Mikhail Petrunin's Simultaneous Multilingual Language Acquisition. I've talked about this in previous videos too, where it's really nice to have some of these older linguaphone type methods or Berlitz methods that give you exactly parallel structure for learning a number of different languages. Because yes, there are people that have real difficulties mixing languages up, confusing them, and therefore that might not be the right approach. And there are people who you're in a hurry to develop language and abilities in this language. And if you try to learn several languages simultaneously, I bet it's going to take you longer to get a foundation in them. But again, if you're taking a broad, long-term approach, if you learn these languages simultaneously using tables like he has here, you're given a context for everything, and you say, let's look how they're related, and you see how they're similar, and you see how they're different, and that helps it all stick all the better in your head. So again, for a long-term approach to learning languages simultaneously and comparing and contrasting them in the comparative philological fashion is a good way of building not just vocabulary, again, taking a holistic approach to languages, but overall competencies in them. So I hope this answers that question that people are always asking me. Please make a video talking about vocabulary learning specifically. What techniques do you use, and what's your best, and why should we use them, and how should we go about doing it? I hope this was interesting and helpful to you, and I thank you for listening.